Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast that explores how we live with, treat, advocate for, write about, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. I've always been interested since the start of this podcast with media representations of characters who are either explicitly stated as having BPD or who seem to be coded with, at the very least, BPD traits. As I'm recording this, it's the day after the season 3 finale, which turned out to be the series finale of Euphoria. And I should say right away, there will be spoilers. And I want to talk specifically about the character of Cassie, since the second season in particular, I've wanted to talk about Cassie Howard or Cassie Howard Jacobs because I think was coded as having BPD. This episode is based on an essay that I posted on my Substack, but I will be adding in some things as well. I really was fascinated by the character of Cassie and also by the character of Rue. I was really interested in how Sam Levinson, the writer and creator of Euphoria, was exploring substance use disorder and BPD traits. But I didn't like how Cassie was portrayed in the third and final season of the series. Unlike a lot of people, based on articles I've seen online, I don't feel that Cassie, who was played very well by Sydney Sweeney, was betrayed by her storyline about sex work, particularly OnlyFans per se. Rather, I think she was betrayed by the superficial exploration of her motivations and the representations of her experiences while she was doing that kind of work. To be clear, sex work isn't necessarily degrading, but I felt like the fact that her sex work was played for laughs and a shock value was degrading. In broad strokes, it does make sense for Cassie to sexualize herself for attention, as that's what she's been doing since the start of the series. For anyone who hasn't watched Euphoria but still wants to listen to this, the series was an adaptation of an Israeli series about a group of young people in high school. First 2 seasons took place in high school. The third and final season did a time jump forward and changed a lot stylistically, but it started out as a kind of lurid, heightened, hallucinogenic teen drama. And each of the main characters in the first season gets a flashback origin story. So we know a little bit about why they do what they do. From the start, like I said, I really feel that Cassie was coded as suffering from BPD traits. Just looking at her behavior in the series, you could strongly argue that she meets the criteria for at least 6 of the 9 symptoms of BPD, and to qualify for a diagnosis in a clinical setting, which of course is not what we have here, but she would need to meet 5 of them. I see her as meeting the criteria for frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, chaotic interpersonal relationships, unstable self-image, impulsivity in at least 2 areas, definitely with her sexual behavior. But we also see her binge drinking quite a bit in season 2. Definitely the rapid mood swings and at least an impulse to self-harm, although that never really goes in. It never goes into a very dire place in the series, thankfully. We're also shown in her backstory that her traits likely derive from trauma due to her father's abandoning the family and his subsequent drug addiction. But that's not the only thing that causes her to behave as she does. We're also shown that she has been sexualized due to her beautiful face and very voluptuous body by older men from a very young age. There are some creepy flashbacks to much older men making inappropriate comments to this, 12 or 13-year-old and kind of ogling her. So this is the background that contextualizes a lot of her behavior, especially in the first season and the second season. No one ever mentions the term borderline personality disorder, to be clear, but Cassie and the people around her on the series have explicitly alluded to her mental instability and to her maladaptive behaviors, that some of which are quite similar to those that are common in people suffering acutely and actively from BPD. Her best friend, Maddie, says at one point, "You love to be loved." And it seems like Cassie does agree with this. When she's fighting with Nate Jacobs, who becomes her eventual husband and who has very recently been Maddie's boyfriend, her best friend's boyfriend, Cassie actually brags to Nate saying, "I am crazier than Maddie." And it's kind of interesting because in that scene, Nate responds by saying, well, craziness is nothing to boast about. But later on, they're hooking up and he says, "I love how fucking sick you are." So that's kind of a turnabout in his thinking on this subject. Side characters have said some really harsh things. Like one classmate who was trying to seduce her and failed said to her, "Any guy who tells you he's interested in you beyond fucking you is lying." And so that's the kind of thing she's heard. She clearly is shown to seek validation through sexuality because she feels like that's the only way to get attention, and specifically to hold on to male attention, because she's presented as a cisgender woman and heterosexual. We don't really see her in any encounters with someone who isn't a straight male. In the second season, we see what happens when she's in a relationship that she feels insecure about. From her very first scene in the second season kind of encapsulates this compulsion that I will just speak for myself. Before I was in functional recovery, what I would call the BPD compulsion to make very poor decisions, especially related to romance. In this first scene in the second season, she gets into a car with Nate. She knows he's been drinking, and she knows he's a very dangerous, toxic person. He's kind of presented as narcissistic. I don't know enough about narcissistic personality disorder to even hazard to diagnose this fictional character, but she knows that he has physically abused Maddie in the past, but she still gets in with him. She knows that her best friend would be, and eventually is, furious that she is getting into the car with Maddie's ex-boyfriend, but she does it anyways. He's speeding, going 100 miles an hour. Initially, she seemed scared, but after a while, she starts to seem like she's really enjoying it. She even unbuckles her seatbelt. And I think for a lot of people with BPD, this kind of risk-taking can be a form of self-soothing. And I thought they did a really good job of showing that in that scene. And it's interesting because in that episode, she does make a few attempts to try to understand what it would be like not to be dependent on a relationship for her identity. She tells Chris McKay, who was her boyfriend in the first season, "I shouldn't be anybody's girlfriend." She tells Nate that she needs to focus on herself as she never learns from her mistakes. So she does have self-knowledge, and I liked that depiction as well. It's just she doesn't know how to cope with being alone. She feels that emptiness. She needs that attention, and she needs that drama as well. And so I found that really relatable from how I felt when I was younger. The pairing of Nate and Cassie is quite interesting too. Anecdotally and from experience, I think people with BPD often attract narcissists and vice versa. Nate and Cassie do start sleeping together and kind of behind Maddie's back. And Cassie becomes more and more obsessive about Nate's attention. She starts waking up before dawn to put herself through this really punishing beauty routine, even though she's already a very attractive girl, to try to lure Nate's eye in the hallways at school. And she has an emotional breakdown when she finds that he might be trying to get back together with Maddie. She lies to her friends. She uses alcohol a lot in that second season. And we even see some suicidal ideation, which isn't portrayed very sensitively. It's almost like a joke in her house, like, oh, Cassie's feeling desperate again. We have to hide the sharp objects, but her mom and sister are kind of laughing about it. But it's pretty true to the experience of a lot of people with BPD when they're feeling insecure about a relationship and desperately trying to hold on to it, even if it isn't healthy Another thing that I really liked about the second season in particular when it comes to Cassie is that Levinson, the writer and creator, really shows Cassie struggling to separate who she is, her identity, from what other people want her to be. And in fact, even in season 3, she says to Maddie, they have a falling out in season 2 after Maddie finds out that Cassie is sleeping with Nate. They reconnect 5 years later, and Maddie says something about how if Cassie wants to get attention as an influencer, she has to have good taste. She has to kind of be herself. And Cassie says, but who am I? That kind of sums up that difficulty that so many people with BPD have of trying to understand at the core who they are. I mean, in reality, everyone is always changing all the time, but I think a lot of people have fixed values, true, genuine interest, a certain temperament, but Cassie doesn't have that. She's trying to be what the other person in the room wants her to be. To depict that in season 2, she is often shown looking in a mirror. In most of her scenes, she is at some point looking in a mirror as if trying to figure out who this person in the reflection is. There was a very famous scene from the second season where she's in the bathroom with Maddie and a couple of her other friends, and she fantasizes telling them everything, that she's sleeping with Nate and that she's never been happier, even though she's screaming and crying. That's one of the instances where she's kind of looking in the mirror. Another one is near the end of the season. She's gone to see a school play that was written and directed by her younger sister, Lexi, and she gets really upset because the play makes fun of Nate's possible homosexuality. It also shows her betrayal of her friend. And we see she goes to the bathroom and she looks at herself in the mirror, and it's really affecting because she's looking at herself with just this self-hatred. But to me, the most powerful moment where she's looking at in a mirror and trying to see what she is, what she feels, is at the end of the 4th episode in season 2. She just had a meltdown at a birthday party for Maddie because Nate was suggesting he would reconnect with Maddie, gave her an expensive gift. And in this scene, we see her staring into her bedroom mirror. And in the reflection is this host of roses, hundreds of roses, a literal rose-colored glass through which she's looking at herself. The roses don't actually exist. I think there are a lot of allusions in that scene. Sam Levinson loves making allusions to classic films, to novels and nonfiction by French surrealists, to novels by Henry Miller, all kinds of allusions. The director of photography said that for this scene with all of these red, pink, and yellowish roses, that he was really inspired by a Mexican mural, early 20th century, kind of around the time Frida Kahlo was painting as well. And actually there's an allusion to a famous Frida Kahlo painting, I think in that same episode. It's when Rue is getting oral sex from Jules and she's imagining herself and Jules as famous portraits or famous couples from films. So he was inspired by a Mexican muralist. But the flowers also remind me of some of the scenes in the film Midsummer, with the kind of idea of floral horror. There is something horrific and beautiful in this scene. And for one thing, I think they show how Cassie's passion can be both a beautiful thing and a monstrous thing. And there's this funereal music in the background. It's kind of beautiful and creepy at the same time. The scene really reminds me of iconography surrounding Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Just kind of her pose and the fact that she's surrounded by flowers. If you know the play Hamlet, probably the one thing you remember about Ophelia is that she eventually drowns herself. She goes mad after Hamlet kills her father Polonius. And a lot of paintings have been painted about Ophelia that kind of romanticize her death. They often include the flowers that she mentions in an earlier scene in Hamlet when she's speaking to the queen through the language of flowers. So here we have Cassie surrounded by flowers, and Cassie was just in a hot tub, whereas a lot of these paintings about Ophelia show her floating in the river after she's drowned. So Cassie was very recently in a hot tub floating and also throwing up from drinking too much. So the two kind of those two things, her recently being submerged in water and the flowers, kind of reminded me of Ophelia. That kind of suggested to me when I was watching it that Cassie was going to go down a very dark path. One thing I can say about the end of Euphoria is at least she's still alive. I didn't know, based on the resonances with Ophelia, whether she would survive or even survive herself, but she did. But I think this is one of the final scenes in the whole series where her emotions are depicted very thoughtfully, very powerfully. I felt there that Sam Levinson was really trying to understand how she felt, what it felt like to have to live with these outsized, out of control emotions. And I thought he found a really great visual metaphor for that in this scene, which is smack in the middle of the series. Unfortunately, her story and her portrayal or the writing for her character, I should say, because I think Sweeney does a good job, just kind of went downhill somewhat from that point, and especially with season 3. Season 3, we don't see Cassie looking into mirrors as much, but it's almost as if phone cameras are replacing those mirrors. I think probably the first time we see her in season 3, she's filming content, fetish content. She's dressed up like a dog. Her poor, long-suffering maid is filming her. So it's sort of like the phone cameras, the video cameras become her reflection. So there is that through line. I liked that. The fact that Cassie, in the 3rd season, wants to amass a large following through OnlyFans doesn't seem out of character to me because, again, she has been seeking validation through a sexualization of herself that maybe seemed almost inevitable to her because she attracted so much of that attention from such a young age. And in fact, there's a way in which her decision to go the OnlyFans route could be seen as her taking control of her sexual image. One of the first things we know about her in the series, back in the first episode of season 1, is that her ex-boyfriends love to film her having sex with them and then release it as revenge porn after the relationship ends. And season 1 also deals with revenge porn related to Kat, another character who also kind of takes that experience of having this video of herself released without her consent and decides to turn the tables and become a content creator or like a cam girl. So you could read the OnlyFans storyline as sort of an attempt by Cassie to gain agency and power and control over her sexual image. It's presented early on, though, that she only wants to do the OnlyFans work to raise flowers for her wedding. Right off the bat in season 3, Cassie is presented as wanting to do these things to be able to buy things with, to be surrounded in the trappings of lavish wealth. It could be that that's just what she's telling herself, and really she has deeper needs beneath them, but it's not really presented that way. At least I didn't feel that way. Later on in the season, there is a very reasonable reason why she needs to make a lot of money quickly, which the series suggests can be done on OnlyFans. I saw a lot of articles by OnlyFans creators saying, well, it's not quite that much of a gold rush, but she does need money later in the season because her now husband, Nate, owes a lot of money to very dangerous people. And so that makes sense. But early on in the season, it just felt like sort of a betrayal of her character to show her only wanting to do this for a very shallow reason of just wanting these roses. There's no exploration of her character, of what's going on inside. You know, is she feeling she's not getting enough attention from Nate? Is she feeling like she wants to creatively express her sexuality? There's nothing. It's sort of like it's just played for laughs. She was played for laughs occasionally in the 2nd season, like in that famous bathroom scene. But we also did see her and understand kind of why she is doing things. even in the school play by her sister, it does seem like her sister understands. There are reasons and why she has these compulsions towards risk taking and maybe overexposing herself sexually. And that's kind of dropped. So I had really hoped to see a more sensitive representation of a young woman really trying to survive these BPD traits that are, as it is in many cases, that are the result of unprocessed trauma. We don't ever have any indication that Cassie has gotten any mental health treatment for the kind of trauma of losing her father in the way that she did, or even the trauma of having these images of herself released by her ex-boyfriends or anything like that. So her being drawn towards this kind of pornography for validation, for attention, reflects the reality of some women with BPD. Some limited studies have suggested that people with BPD may be overrepresented among sex workers. Now, I don't want to generalize. Most people with BPD aren't sex workers. I mean, that's probably just, I don't have empirical evidence for that, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not the norm, but they may be more than average. Some people, for various reasons, whether it's to do with trauma and to receive some kind of validation or semblance of love for that, it might be slightly more common. It's not unreasonable to think she would do something like that, but there's no examination of her inner life. And she increasingly is shown as just this shallow influencer pursuing fame for money. Later in the season, I think it's episode 6 or 7, she has to do it to save her husband's life. And early on, it's kind of just played as, oh, isn't she ridiculous and superficial? And she'll do anything for money. And literally, they show her in some very controversial poses, posing as a baby. And there's just no attempt to understand how she feels as she's creating this content, which is very much at odds with how she was presented in seasons 1 and 2, where she was very emotional. She did seem quite intuitive about her own behavior, even if she felt it hard to make changes to her behavior, to her actions. She was still reacting to her emotions, but she had depth. And here she has basically nothing. And I felt like in season 2, especially up until that point with her looking in the mirror with the roses, she was a three-dimensional character. But in season 3, it seemed like she was almost a parody of a woman who scores high on the so-called hot crazy matrix, this offensive metric assessing the supposedly ideal woman to date. You know, she's just mentally unbalanced enough to be great in bed without being too much of a nightmare, and she's very attractive. And I think one reason it sort of shocked me how crass this season 3 portrayal is because Levinson is so good at depicting substance use disorder. Rue Bennett, the main character of this series, played wonderfully by Zendaya, is a drug addict, mostly an opioid addict. And Levinson has very openly talked about his own battles with addiction. It seemed like he really felt comfortable in writing a really fleshed out character with a drug addiction who in some episodes does horrible things, but your empathy remains with her. And part of that is owing to Zendaya's amazing performance, but Sydney Sweeney is a very talented actress as well. And she's becomes sort of a caricature of herself by the end of the series. And a lot of people have commented on the fact that, especially in this 3rd season, all of the main female characters, except for Lexi, Cassie's sister, are involved in sex work in some way. He is really obsessed with presenting women who are engaged in sex work. But I really have to contrast Levinson with someone like Sean Baker, the director of Honora and the Florida Project. Honora won a lot of awards, but to me, the Florida Project it's a really wonderful movie. And both of them depict sex workers with a lot more nuance, a lot more empathy. And I'm interested in this in part because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on representations of women in the pleasure quarters of Japan and the way they were represented in literature in the 20th century. So basically, sex workers in early 20th century Japan and how they were depicted in literature. So I find it fascinating how people gravitate toward that subject. But to me, it's most interesting when it's exploring the characters and why they're doing what they're doing, how they feel about it, what are the sociocultural factors that are causing people to do this. I think Levinson really struggles to portray women with empathy in this final season, just in general, but he especially struggles with Cassie. And I think there are several reasons for this. Part of it is because behavior that is coded as related to BPD is often very dramatic. And the image is that, these are women who are really difficult to deal with. Once you actually talk to women like that, though, I think you understand why. But I think it's really easy to sensationalize the behavior. This has been a common problem in a lot of films and TV series that have characters who seem to have BPD, most famously with something like Fatal Attraction, the film from the 1980s. I think it's also hard because Cassie is played by Sydney Sweeney, who is just such a cultural figure at this moment. She's more than just a movie or TV star. She's someone who almost every week starts these viral conversations. And I get the feeling that Levinson just wanted to take advantage of that. She's a very fearless actress. I mean, will share her body in all kinds of ways. And I think he wanted to take advantage of that fearlessness, but mostly maybe to drum up controversy, because controversy would get people talking about the show. So everything with her in this season feels just really exaggerated and almost cartoonish. And I think it shows too why it's very difficult to get sensitive portrayals of BPD in television and film. And it's because it's not just, if you have someone writes a book about BPD, it's a single author, you just have to deal with one person's representation of BPD. But with a film or a TV series, there are all kinds of people involved. There is a writer and director. Even if they're the same person, then there's the actor or actress who portrays the character. There are the people who clothe them, the costumers, the people who light them. All of these things are variables that could slightly nudge a sensitive portrayal of, or a sensitive, well-written depiction of BPD into something more sensational or exploitative. So just to wrap up, I know that some people don't even like it when mental health diagnoses are assigned to fictional characters. And I actually have a whole episode about that, about Dazai Osamu's No Longer Human and the idea of trying to diagnose a character and should we do it. I also think it's really complicated. You can't tell a creative artist like Levinson or anyone else that you must write this way about BPD. For one thing, that's a really slippery slope once you start censoring people. And I'm a creative writer myself. I wouldn't want someone telling me you can only use these words and you can't use other ones. But I do think that when you have what is one of the biggest TV shows in the world, as Levinson did with Euphoria, there are responsibilities that come with it. And in particular, I think at one point, Euphoria was the most talked about show on social media. So it's very much being shared among young people. And it was quite explicitly targeted at young people, Gen Z, kind of high school students, college students, early 20s. Certainly old people like me watched it too, but it was targeted at them. And I know some of my university students have mentioned watching it or enjoying it. So I think when you have that kind of a platform, you do have a sort of responsibility to present people thoughtfully, with humanity, with empathy, especially if you seem to be alluding to a pattern of behaviors that would fit a very stigmatized diagnosis like PPD. And maybe in that sense, it is a good thing that Cassie was never diagnosed with it. But I just was really disappointed in how like a three-dimensional character became so one-dimensional. And as I said, I think he did a wonderful job of portraying drug addiction, because that was something I suffered from when I was younger as well. He really was able to give a rich portrait of Rue. So it does beg the question, why was it impossible to do that with Cassie? And I think the series also shows how easily a portrayal of BPD traits can be exploited or cheapened. I think there are good portrayals that exist out there, but this one was a case where, at the end at least, we no longer saw the dignity or humanity of Cassie like we did in that scene of her in front of the mirror with the roses. I really feel like the beautiful song by Labyrinth and Zendaya that plays in the second season is most clearly meant to refer to Rue, the Hey Lord, you know I'm trying every day not to use, trying to get better, trying not to hurt the people I love. I feel like that should have been applied to Cassie as well. Thanks for listening, and I hope that you have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.